Soon after my mother gave birth to her second child, she went to Zoom Zoom. Zoom Zoom was a favorite haunt of hers, a cafeteria-like restaurant that was on Lexington Avenue across from Bloomingdale's, which was another favorite haunt of hers. So she sat at the counter and she had a hot dog. And about a week later, she was rushed to the emergency room with an unknown virus. Hours later, the young Jewish, apparently good-looking ER doctor walked into her room and said, "So, what's a nice Jewish girl like you doing eating a pork hot dog?" It turned out she had trichinosis, the disease you get when you eat an uncooked piece of pork and the live round worms get into your body and multiply. I won't go on, but essentially, they squeeze you to death if it's not treated. I was only 3 at the time of her hot dog encounter, but years later, she told me that as she lay on her hospital bed, she pleaded for her life. Bargaining with God, she promised that if she lived, from that point forward, she would never eat pork again. She would never feed pork to her children. Talk about Jewish guilt. That was my introduction to why we don't eat pork at our house. It was also my introduction to pleading with God. Fast forward to when I was 16. My cousin Alfred was killed in an accident. He was 8 at the time, and his 10-year-old brother and he were on jet skis in a lake in Arizona. And his brother lost control of the jet skis, and the machine crashed into Alfred, and he died from internal bleeding in his mom's arms. My grandmother pleaded with God when she found out about her grandson's death. I remember listening to her sobbing. "Why couldn't it have been me? I'm old, God. Take me instead." And years later, all these memories came rushing back at me. I was in Jerusalem. I was studying this Mishnah, this rabbinic law. From the 2nd centuries, the rabbis were debating what a bracha levata is, a prayer in vain. It's prohibited, apparently, this prayer in vain, because the outcome has already been determined. And they actually give 2 examples. They say if your wife's pregnant, you can't say, "Oh, may it be a boy," because it's already been determined. And if there are firefighters running down the street, you can't say, "Oh, may it not be my house," because something's on fire already. My mom's prayer in her hospital bed was acceptable. But my grandmother's prayer was a bracha levata. It was too late. But does pleading with God really work? Tonight on Kol Nidre, we plead for our lives, not theoretically, but in real time. For the next 24 hours, as Rabbi Hudson said in the dark, we wear the color of white, the color of purity and tshuva, the color we'll one day wear when we're buried and gently put back into the earth. We wear white because we're pleading for a year of health and meaning, of connection and renewal. At the beginning of services, as she said, we started with an empty aron, an empty ark, because, as she said, the word aron means coffin, meaning that we were staring at our own coffin as we pleaded for safety and security. Throughout Yom Kippur, we say Vidui, the communal confessional prayer. admitting to how we've gone astray. And as I said, it's the only other time when we say this, but we say it on our deathbed, and we plead for forgiveness then too. This summer, I found myself pleading with God many times. I have to admit it's not rational. It was, I'm going to just call it a spiritual reflex. I don't actually think that God is some being up in the sky that listens specifically to me. I don't believe that God is swayed one way or another by our pleas and then makes a decision on how to run the universe. That would mean that we were God and God was following our commandments. My theology is a lot more amorphous, as many of yours is. What I call God is a force in the universe that animates the world and connects us all. And yet I pleaded with God, and I wasn't alone. First, I met someone who had recently moved to LA. He was working on the East Coast and felt his life was spiraling out of control. A little too much alcohol, a little too often, and he couldn't stop, and he yearned for a new start. He loved his parents, but he needed some distance, and we sat together in my office, and we cried about his pain, depression, and memories of past sexual abuse. We cried about how he often feels different than everyone else, like he's alone, traveling through this world with no one getting him. I could see the pain leaking from his pores. The day I met him was Friday, and he came to services that night for Erev Shabbat. And as he sat in the courtyard, I could see him praying intensely. Honestly, I have no idea what the heck he was saying, but I sensed his soul reaching out, raw and searching. Looking at him, knowing just a bit of his personal story and what was going on with him, sent me pleading before God. God, don't leave him. Don't walk away. He's asking for help. Send this young man the love and the support he needs. Surround him with people who will hold his pain, professionals who will counsel him, new friends who will appreciate him. Envelop him in community. And please, God, don't let him slide back into his old destructive ways. Show him patience. Again, I admit, pleading with God isn't rational. At times it can seem absurd. I know I'm a rabbi, but who am I to plead on his behalf? I had just met him. But the pain was so intense, and my outreach was in response to his torment. And then without Rabbi Rozov at our side, the summer got worse. Many of you know that Rebecca Duretsky died in July. She was an 18-year-old girl who grew up at our synagogue. She was in our religious school, in our Hadi youth group. She worked as a madricha on Sunday mornings, always attended high holiday services with her family, and she had just graduated from Laces. On a trip to New York with her mom, visiting family, she contracted a virus and it spread to her brain, and she died really within a day. Her family and many of us in this community who grew up with her are devastated. Weeks before, she was a perfectly healthy high school student. So after her funeral in New York and Shiva in New York, Rebecca's parents came back to Los Angeles, and they sat with me and Rabbi Hudson and their other daughter, Julia, in Josie's office. The anguish and the anger and the confusion they each felt at different moments was palpable. Their emotional agony was so difficult to witness that at times I had to look down. I could only muster one word: help. That's it. I'm not sure what kind of help I was pleading for, or who I wanted God to help, or how that help would make things any better. It was just this deep calling out, help. We Jews, like all people, have pleaded with God for centuries. When we feel desperate, powerless, in need of a sign of hope, yearn for a way to connect, or when we want something deeply important. Our Rosh Hashanah and Haftarah reads about Hannah pleading for a child. On Yom Kippur afternoon, we're going to hear the psychological agony of Jonah as he pleads for his death. When in Egypt, the Israelites pleaded with God to release them from their bondage, and Pharaoh actually pleads with Moses to intercede on his behalf. In the desert, Moses pleads to God to heal his sister Miriam. And both Samson and King David plead with God for renewed strength and protection during war. Some of these prayers are answered. Many are not. This summer, I came to realize that it's not about God's response. It's not about the outcome of our pleading hearts. Instead, what's important is why we're pleading. The emotional yearning and pain, honesty and vulnerability. That's what matters. And it's not just why, but it's also the who and the how. After we plead, who do we realize is there for us? And how have we changed after our struggle or tragedy, loss or deep disappointment? That's when we learn what's really important in life. That's where the message lies. After Rabbi Peter Noble, our senior interim rabbi, had a series of heart attacks in early August, I found myself pleading with God once again. This time, the messages of my beseeching changed over time. The 2 weeks of his illness were an emotional roller coaster ride of hope, and then no hope, and then again hope, and then a lot of waiting. And anyone in this room who's ever been the medical advocate and emotional support for someone you love in the hospital knows what I'm talking about. The day after Peter Noble's heart attacks, the Torah portion was Ve'etchanan, which literally means I pleaded. So Moses is talking and he comes to the end of his life, and in a moment of great vulnerability, he admits to the Israelite people, he says he knows that God told him he's not going to be allowed to enter the land of Israel, but he pleads with God just to let him feel the soil, just to let him walk on the land. So it was Saturday morning when I first stood at Rabbi Noble's bedside and pleaded with God. Rabbi Hudson happened to pick up an early morning message from Rabbi Noble's son on the East Coast saying that Peter was in the hospital. So by 5 a.m., she was at Rabbi Noble's bedside with his wife, Elaine. I woke up late that morning, 6:30, and I saw the text from Josie, and I got to the hospital by 7 to relieve her of a bar mitzvah service that she was scheduled to lead that morning. And I said to God, come on, don't take him. There are so many other people who are physically alive but not mentally alive. And then, I don't like to admit it, but I started naming names. Take them instead. Don't take Peter. He's vibrant. He's such a wonderful man. He has so much to offer and to teach, to enjoy and to embrace. And before I left his bedside that day, I said to him, Peter, Elaine needs you. Try fighting. We're here for you. And then the week went on. Rabbi Noble's situation appeared to be unchanging. My pleas to save him changed. Now I didn't want him to suffer. Please, if he's meant to pass from this world, then take him soon. Don't let him and don't let his family suffer. He wouldn't want that. And that day by his bedside, I walked up to him and I said, I hope your transition goes well, whatever the heck that means. And then toward the end of the week, the doctors told the family that they needed to wait some more, that it was premature to make any more decisions, and there was possibility that he could get out of this. And so then I pleaded with God the final time. I said, okay, I admit it, God. Just to state the obvious, I am not God. I have no idea what's going on. Maybe this is simply the journey that he's meant to be on, and I can't understand it. The 11th century Jewish medical doctor Maimonides taught that among the ways of tshuva are for the penitent to constantly shout before God with crying and pleading. Why we're pleading today needs to be the focus of the next 24 hours. Our ancestors of the Hebrew Bible pleaded because they wanted things like life and children and health and safety and freedom and even death when they were in deep agony. They pleaded like we do because it's a reflex, because they were desperate, because they were in deep need. So why are you pleading? I imagine all of us have pleaded at one point in our lives, regardless of the outcome. Afterwards, did you notice who was there for you? The people in the hospital who brought you a meal, who took you out for coffee, someone who came to your home for a minyan or just called to check in. Did you slowly gravitate toward others who've walked a similar path that you have? And even though none of us want adversity, I can't stand it. When people say, oh, he's better off now, or he's in a better place, or, well, that's how God wanted it. I find that infuriating and simple-minded and insensitive. And yet it's also true that due to adversity, we change, and sometimes in beautiful ways. Our patriarch Jacob wrestled with an angel all night long, and he wrenched his hip. He was permanently disfigured, and yet in the morning, he pleaded for a blessing. He wouldn't let that divine being go without a word of hope. When you've suffered adversity or pleaded with God for yourself or for another person, what is the blessing you gained? How did you change? Have you embraced life even harder? Do you compromise more readily? Have you reprioritized your life? Do you push yourself to enjoy simchas even when it's challenging? Did you become more sensitive in ways you weren't before? I hope you don't judge me, and I hope you don't judge yourself for what we plead for. As I said, pleading is not rational, it's from the heart. But what I do know is that community and love are two necessary forces that can bring us through life's difficult times. The times some of us engage in that knee-jerking spiritual pleading. Community and love hold us together. Hold us together when all we have left is help, please, how? Rabbi Hudson and I were deeply moved by the many Temple Israel members and our fellow clergy who reached out to us this summer with phone calls and emails, offers to relieve us from the responsibilities of our young children, offers to even cook for us, and even a massage. I imagine that at some point in your life, you've all been touched by the power of community and the impulse to choose life even in the midst of darkness. Yom Kippur reminds us that we're not alone in this struggle. The story goes, why did God bless Shabbat? Rabbi Missaghieh says, because Shabbat didn't have a partner. You see, the first day had the second, the third had the fourth, the fifth had the sixth, but Shabbat had no partner. So what happened? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said that Shabbat pleaded with the Holy One. Everyone has a partner, but I have nothing. And God answered, the community of Israel will be your partner. And that's why we Jews stood at Sinai to receive Torah. Because God didn't want anyone to be alone. Not Shabbat and not any of us. We're all in this together, folks. None of us are alone. Standing in front of God on the holiest day, pleading with our open hearts, showing our vulnerability, being real, being honest, being us. That's our goal for the next 24 hours. Pleading and listening to what's really important in life. Amen.